Living and working in and around Los Angeles in the 1920s and 1930s was amazing. Think about it. It was a prosperous place, filled with incredibly smart and talented and wealthy people who were involved in a new and creative industry, making movies. Just imagine all of the writers and the actors and the producers and the directors living in this really beautiful place with perfect weather and clear blue skies, surrounded by mountains and the Pacific Ocean. And they're working for the movie studios, such as RKO, United Artists, and Warner Brothers. There were plenty of jobs and everybody was making a really great living. And people were now living in ways that were once only enjoyed by royalty and the fabulously wealthy throughout history. And yet all these great architects creating Mediterranean-style houses, as well as developing their own unique American styles that showcased their enthusiasm and excitement about the future. But at the same time, there were also houses and buildings being constructed that were greatly influenced by historic homes and castles found in Europe. Among the most famous of which is the Chateau Marmont, located at 8221 Sunset Boulevard. But its initial address was 8225 Marmont Lane. Unfortunately, today it is perhaps best known as the location of John Belushi's death, when he died of a drug overdose in Bungalow number 3 on March 5th of 1982. But there is so much more to know. There are a lot of basic facts about the Chateau Marmont, and I'm going to tell you a whole bunch of them. And I'm also going to cover some of the gossip that you may or may not have heard as well. But for the most part, I'd like to just kind of give you an idea and understanding of the experience of being at the Chateau Marmont over the course of time. For starters, for those who go there for the first time, it's actually a bit difficult to figure out how to even get into the building. Yeah, there's a driveway that leads to the garage, but there's no sidewalk, and so it seems kind of weird to walk up a driveway to get into a hotel. But if you drive around it today towards the back, there seems to be a doorway of some sort, but it's closed off, and it's impossible to know what's even on the other side, even if you did manage to go through it. But if you look at photos of the chateau when it was first built, and for decades after, the area that seems to be the back of the building was actually the front. And they had an open space with a lawn where guests could come and go through a cloistered walkway, and they could easily socialize. And today that whole space is blocked off. And from the street, it is impossible to know what's going on the other side of the trees. Like everything else, I prefer thinking about the Chateau Marmont pre-1970. You know, when the world was less crowded and people tried to look and act their best when in public, and there was a lot less anger in the world, and people seemed to be much happier than they have been post-1970. And so let's travel back in time a little bit, all the way to the beginning, and see how the Chateau Marmont developed and became what it is. In the late 1920s, the area where the Chateau Marmont is located was little more than a barren hillside with sagebrush and scrub, though it has also been said that onions and poinsettias and avocados grew there. Either way, it was kind of a no man's land, and the roads around it weren't even paved. It was during November of 1926 that a prominent Los Angeles attorney named Fred Horowitz pulled up to the side of the hill, got out of his car, took out a photograph of the Chateau Amboise, a royal retreat in France, which is the final resting place of Leonardo da Vinci, by the way, and decided he would recreate it right there as a residential complex with apartments for people to be able to lease. And so he acquired the land, and a few months later, in 1927, Horowitz commissioned his brother-in-law to design the 7-story L-shaped building. Because he was influenced by the French Gothic style, he insisted that the design include thick, buff-colored walls, spiky turrets, steep roofs, some arched windows, raftered ceilings, and a vaulted colonnade. And so in the end, the building was really beautiful and imposing. It was also the tallest structure for several miles around. Also, as mentioned previously, 2 flanks of the building would overlook a grassy courtyard, and that was the front of the Chateau Marmont. Now, he wanted the building to be earthquake and fireproof, and so the walls would need to be really thick. And so it turned out that the Chateau Marmont survived major earthquakes in 1933, 1953, 1971, 1987, and 1994 without sustaining any major structural damage. During construction, it became necessary to pave Montiel Road, and that kind of upset some of the locals because they were worried about the traffic that the building would soon attract. And so while construction was going on, Horowitz kicked around some ideas for the building. Now, he considered calling it the Chateau Sunset, and also Chateau Hollywood. But then he decided upon Chateau Marmont after the small street running across the front of the property. Even though the name Marmont sounds French, the name of the road had actually been named after an Englishman named Percy Marmont. He was a British stage actor who had appeared in dozens of Hollywood films between 1916 and 1928 before returning to England. It isn't exactly known why the street was named after him, by the way. Now, as far as the interior, no two apartments would be the same, and they would all be distinctly furnished and decorated. He also wanted to install state-of-the-art kitchens and bathrooms. Because it was designed to be a residential building, it does not look like a hotel or feel like a hotel. And so the design offered its residents discretion and privacy from the very beginning. Remember, at the time, there were many New Yorkers moving to Southern California, and many of them were wealthy writers and directors from Broadway, as well as investors who were buying land and opening businesses to take advantage of the population boom and, of course, the great weather. And so the Chateau Marmont was designed to be a kind of sanctuary for New Yorkers who came there to work and were not seeking the crowds or attention that luxury hotels would offer. From the outside, it really is a very attractive building. As you can see, it has a series of steeply pitched roofs covered with ornate gray tiles. And there are many square-headed windows with multiple panes of glass that open up with hand cranks. And of course, there are a number of balconies with enough room for sunbathing and dining and entertaining. Many of the balconies offer views all the way down to the ocean. The chateau opened its doors for business on February 1st, 1929. Local newspapers described the 63-room chateau as Los Angeles' newest, finest, and most exclusive apartment house. It further added that it was superbly situated, close enough to active businesses to be accessible and far enough away to ensure quiet and privacy. For the inaugural reception, over 300 people passed through the building, including a lot of local press. In that same year, by the way, the architect of the Chateau Marmont also designed the El Royale apartment complex. And that can still be seen today, located at the intersection of Rosewood Avenue and Rossmore Avenue in the Hancock Park neighborhood of Los Angeles. And I'll talk about that in another video. Unfortunately, 8 months after the chateau welcomed its first tenants, the stock market crashed. And even though leasing the apartments was no problem at the beginning, they were not being renewed. And so a couple of years later, in 1931, Horowitz sold the apartment building to a gentleman named Albert E. Smith. He was the co-founder of Vitagraph Studios, and he paid $750,000 in cash for the building. That was the equivalent of $14 million in 2022. Now, in case you're wondering how Mr. Smith got all that money, Vitagraph Studios was co-founded by Albert Smith in 1897. And 10 years later, in 1907, it was the most prolific American film production company, producing many famous silent films. And it was bought by Warner Brothers in 1925. And so Mr. Smith was rolling in dough. And it was he who converted the building into a hotel, just in time for the 1932 Summer Olympics, which were being held in Los Angeles. And so he converted the apartments into suites with kitchens and living rooms. He also had the rooms filled with many antiques that he was able to purchase because of all the Depression-era estate sales in the area. And he also hired a former silent film actress named Ann Little to manage the hotel. Her career was most prolific during the silent film era of the early 1910s through the early 1920s. Today, most of her films are lost, with only 12 known to survive. But as the manager of the hotel, she did really great, and everything went fantastic throughout the 1930s. As a hotel, Europeans really appreciated the pension-style accommodations as opposed to the full-service American hotels that were in vogue at the time. One of the greatest assets of the Chateau Marmont was the privacy that it offered, especially since there was never any kind of grand entrance, and there was never really a lobby with restaurants and bars as could be found in other hotels. For the most part, residents would drive into the underground garage, and then they would take an elevator up to their rooms. And that sort of privacy was clearly what celebrities such as Greta Garbo and Bette Davis and Howard Hughes were looking for when they wanted a place to stay where they could avoid the glances of strangers and the cameras of the paparazzi. Throughout the 1940s and 1950s and all the way up to about 1963, the chateau was owned by a gentleman named Erwin Brettauer. He was a German banker who had funded some films in Germany, and he was noted for allowing black guests, which broke the long-standing color line in Hollywood and Beverly Hills hotels. Incidentally, during World War II, the hotel served as an air raid shelter for local residents because it was so strongly constructed. Some of the details that guests have appreciated have included the tasseled key rings, old-fashioned light switches that needed to be pushed in to be able to get turned on, vintage appliances, Art Deco sconces, and stained glass. Now, as mentioned previously, the Chateau Marmont does not have a lobby. However, it does offer a large, kind of European-style living room space with a beam ceiling, a lot of plush furniture, and very ornate lamps. And outside, in the front courtyard, is a cloistered walkway with hand-painted ceilings, ornate lanterns, and a water fountain. Considering its location right off one of the most famous streets in California, it really is amazing that the cottages and bungalows and swimming pool afford as much privacy as they do. But they really do feel like secret hideaways. And so let's talk a little bit about those right now. In the 1930s, 9 Spanish-style cottages were built next to the hotel, on the other side of the swimming pool. And they were all acquired by the hotel in the 1940s. In the 1950s, 4 bungalows were also built, 2 of which were designed by Craig Elwood. He was a very influential Los Angeles-based modernist architect, and I'm going to talk about him more in another video. This photo shows the Chateau Marmont with the Players Club in the foreground. And if you look to the right, you can see the ornate streetlights. These were called Metropolitan streetlights, and they were specifically designed for this area of California. By the way, word has it that there once existed a secret tunnel that connected the Players Club to the Chateau Marmont. But there doesn't seem to be much of a justification of why that would be the case, but it also might be true. I don't know. It's a bit of a mystery. Incidentally, the Players Club was opened by director Preston Sturgis at the end of the 1940s. Prior to being a director and moving out to California, he was the son of a very wealthy socialite, and he wanted to create a place where millionaires, such as himself, could eat and drink and be entertained in a way that they were accustomed to on the East Coast, but wasn't necessarily that easy to find when they were in Southern California. And so he created a place for them. And it proved to be quite popular, although word has it that it never made too much money because Preston Sturgis was more interested in creating a cool place to entertain friends than he was in turning out a profitable restaurant. Now, as far as some of the gossip concerning guests and visitors at the Chateau Marmont, we all know that Hollywood has always been filled with all sorts of weirdos and sex maniacs and bunches of pedophiles and drug addicts here and there. But it also attracts a lot of very creative people who live and work in really interesting ways in order to foster inspiration. And so the Chateau Marmont has always been a residence of interesting people in the entertainment industry. Beginning in the 1930s, Jean Harlow used to stay there. In fact, word has it that she had an affair with Clark Gable at the hotel in 1933 while she was supposed to be on her honeymoon with her third husband. And in that same year, Laurence Olivier also stayed there. Literary genius F. Scott Fitzgerald used to stay at the Chateau Marmont when he was in California working on screenplays, and legend has it that Howard Hughes would rent Room 64, which is the 2-bedroom penthouse that has a very large balcony. And the stories of him walking up the staircase from the garage to his rooms are probably not true. And the same with the weird stories of him spying on girls in the swimming pool. What spying would there really be? I mean, he had a balcony, he looked over the balcony, girls were swimming in the pool. Not that big of a deal. Why in the world people need to call that spying, I have no idea. Especially considering how handsome and incredibly wealthy he was, it's not like he needed to spy on women swimming in the swimming pool. A simple invitation to his penthouse would easily have been enough for probably any women at the time to rush up there to be on his side. So I think people just kind of write stuff like that just to, have something to write about. Orson Welles used to also stay at the chateau, as did Robert Mitchum and Humphrey Bogart. In fact, legend has it that Humphrey Bogart put his mother up at the Chateau Marmont in 1938. And many years later, it was said that Desi Arnaz used to stay at the Chateau Marmont whenever he got into an argument with Lucy, and while he was there, supposedly he would hook up with aspiring starlets. And there are photos of Marilyn Monroe staying at the Chateau Marmont, and the stories of Errol Flynn and Dennis Hopper having a lot of sex with a lot of women in the chateau are probably true. Actress Vivien Leigh used to also stay at the Chateau Marmont, and to jazz up her apartment, she supposedly brought along paintings by Renoir and Picasso. Legend has it that director Nicholas Ray stayed at the chateau for 8 years, most famously while he was directing Rebel Without a Cause. And so, as you can imagine, James Dean was a frequent visitor to the chateau, as were Natalie Wood and Sal Mineo, both of whom were teenagers at the time, and both of whom were having sexual flings with the director who, at the time, was in his 40s. At the same time, Natalie Wood was also in a relationship with Dennis Hopper, who was also starring in Rebel Without a Cause and spent quite a bit of time at the chateau. And word has it that it was at the Chateau Marmont where Anthony Perkins and Tab Hunter met. And they would stay there together, and it appeared like they were just friends, but behind closed doors, the relationship was something quite different. In the 1960s, Roman Polanski and Sharon Tate moved into the chateau as newlyweds. But they soon moved out after Sharon Tate got pregnant and they rented a house, and unfortunately, we know how that story ended. And the story of John Bonham riding a motorcycle through the lobby while Led Zeppelin while staying there is probably not true. After all, how would you get a motorcycle up the stairs or into an elevator? But the stories of them staying there and drinking a ton of alcohol and supposedly handcuffing female fans to beds for days at a time probably are true. Or maybe they're not. Those who know don't tell, and those who tell probably don't really know. Another famous guest of the Chateau Marmont was Jim Morrison, who, it has been said, was climbing onto a roof or onto a terrace or trying to swing into his room or something, and he slipped and he fell on his back. And the singer claimed that it was at that time spent at the hotel where he used up 8 of his 9 lives. And it was at the Chateau Marmont in 1978 where Roman Polanski spent his last night in the USA before fleeing to Europe. Now, as far as the 1980s, as previously mentioned, John Belushi died in one of the cottages after mixing heroin and cocaine. It was a combo called a speedball. And 2 of the people who had last seen John Belushi alive were Robin Williams, who was visiting after playing at a comedy club nearby, and Robert De Niro, who was also staying at the chateau. Interestingly, on that same night, Billy Idol smashed up his bungalow and supposedly stood naked on his balcony. But the police and everybody else were way too busy dealing with John Belushi to care about whatever Billy Idol was up to. In the 1990s, it is said that Johnny Depp had lived there with Kate Moss, and quite possibly on his own as well, and it's also been said that Keanu Reeves was also a resident. Interestingly, today Johnny Depp lives right down the road in an equally historic building off of North Sweetser. Also, Depp used to visit his friend, writer Hunter S. Thompson, who used to stay at the chateau in order to get some writing done. And in more contemporary times, Scarlett Johansson was staying there when she and Benicio del Toro either had sex or didn't have sex in the elevator. Nobody seems to know for sure, not even them. It was also while visiting the Chateau Marmont that Heath Ledger was caught on video snorting cocaine, which he probably should not have done considering he became a father just a few months previously. And it was while leaving the hotel in 2004 that famed photographer Helmut Newton, who was living at the chateau for at least 3 years part-time with his wife, lost control of his car and slammed into a wall. He died later that day at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. And in 2010, Sofia Coppola directed a film entitled Somewhere about a Hollywood actor who was living at the Chateau Marmont. By the way, it was in 1976 that the chateau was dedicated an LA Historic Cultural Monument. In 2020, plans were announced to transform the Chateau Marmont into a members-only hotel. It was also announced that it would offer a dedicated domestic staff, private dining, and long-term personal belongings storage to an invitation-only crowd who will have a financial ownership in the chateau. All things considered, that is probably for the best in order to maintain the legendary Chateau Marmont for the future. And so this concludes this micro lesson about the Chateau Marmont. In the comments below and share what's on your mind. If you enjoyed this video, please share it, please give it a thumbs up, and subscribe to my channel. Until next time, I wish you safe travels on all your journeys.